And hello once again to the latest lecture series that I do on this little channel here. Today we're going to be talking about narrative time, mostly through the work of Genette in his work Narrative Discourse and Narrative Discourse Revisited. That's where you'll find a lot of this kind of stuff. It is all about narrative and how basically time is used in stories. Predominantly through the idea of order, duration, and frequency, but we're going to be going into those in quite a bit of depth. You'll see on the screen there's a lot of like these terms and names and what have you, which can be quite scary when you first see them, but they're really quite easy. Okay, so before we actually do get into that, I'm just going to say I've been doing this for ages. If you appreciate this stuff, you can always support me by checking out my books or going onto Patreon. But we are going to talk about that later. So let's get into narrative time via Genette. Okay, so narratives, right, are stories, right, told generally in, or at least in terms of how Genette and many narratologists look at it. Stories are found, in the sense, in narrative texts, right? Not in prose, not in drama, but you can actually say they are in those too, but we're not going to be looking at those. So think about novels, short stories, novellas, novelettes, those kinds of things. Alright. Fun. So, order, duration, frequency. Basically, think about the events that take place. Do events take place chronologically, or do things get varied and changed up? Now, order is the one that's really looking at chronology specifically. So, if a story is in chronological order, that means that the events occur as they occur, right? So, it starts at the beginning, and it ends at the end. That is a chronological order. However, we often move away from this into analepsis, prolepsis, and acrony. Acrony is quite uncommon though. Okay, so analepsis and prolepsis, these sound difficult, but I've also put you in brackets. Analepsis, also known as the flashback, right? When you go back in time for a short period or for a long period to usually tell something about the narrative, that is of importance, right? And then prolepsis is an anticipation. I like to also just kind of call it a flash forward because it's easier to remember it in that particular sense, but strictly speaking, flash forward is not actually a term, although there is a series called flash forward, but strictly speaking, flash forward is not actually a term. It is an anticipation. It is something that is going to happen, not necessarily even within the story itself, but it is something that's going to happen in the future. Right, so think of it like that. Analepsis, going back into the past. Prolepsis, going into the future. Acrony is basically where it becomes so difficult to tell, essentially. Are you going backwards or forwards in time? Where exactly are you in the story? And that is where acrony comes in, where it can be difficult to tell whether you are forwards or backwards. Like, events happen in kind of strange orders and make it difficult for you to really understand when things are actually taking place. That is what, when it comes to the idea of acrony. Acrony is quite a postmodern concept. You won't really find it in many texts because it's also difficult to actually do. Okay, so you might think this is easy. Okay, cool. Analepsis and prolepsis. And if you're doing like low level, still say second year university or something, and you're looking at Genetian time, analepsis and prolepsis are kind of like all you really need to know, right? There's flashbacks, there's flash forwards. Quite simple. However, it gets a lot more complicated when you go into the different types. Now, these different types can be found in both analepsis and prolepsis, okay? So that's why I'm not going to be discussing them. I'm not going to just discuss analepsis and then prolepsis. I'm going to discuss them together. So, you get internal and external analepsis and prolepsis. Quite simply, this means that it takes place inside or outside the narrative, right? So, if, let's just say, for instance, there is a story, and the story is about two people who are in love with one another. Okay, cool. If you were to have an internal analepsis, you would essentially go back in time, right? So you're doing a flashback to sort of say, how did these two end up together? And if that is contained within the narrative, then it is internal. If it takes place outside of the narrative, it is external, right? Quite simple. That's like a very basic thing, right? Analepsis, an internal analepsis would be, it takes place inside in the past, and an internal prolepsis takes place inside but in the future. external is outside. It's quite simple. Then it gets a little bit more complicated when it comes into the idea of heterodiegetic and homodiegetic. Okay, so heterodiegetic, or let's first just say diegesis or diegetic, is referring to the text. Okay, so hetero and homo, and most people would associate those words with sexualities. You're heterosexual, homosexual. They are not exclusive to, therefore, in case those who don't know that, hetero basically means different, homo means the same. So, if it is heterodiegetic, it is text that is different, and homodiegetic is text that is the same. Okay, now when you're looking at it like this, an analepsis or a prolepsis, that is heterodiegetic or homodiegetic, is something that takes place basically outside of the narrative or inside the narrative, but in a different sense to internal and external. Internal and external basically say it's going to be inside or outside text, right? However, when it gets to heterodiegetic, it is basically something that is, it's a little bit annoying, alright? So because they can be inside or outside, heterodiegetic is something that is basically not related to the primary story. It is something that exists external to the primary story. So remember I said the whole idea of there being a romance. And if you go back and you're looking at something that is internal, so it takes place in the same story, right? And it's sort of saying how these two people got together, right? That would be internal. If that story is specifically related to the actual narrative that is happening, it is homodiegetic because it takes place within the same text, right? Same text, homodiegetic. Heterodiegetic would say, let's say we're going to do a flashback, and this flashback is about how one of the characters used to be divorced. We don't actually go into this. We don't go into the divorce. We just know they were divorced. So we know that sometime in the past, there was a different narrative that had to do with them getting divorced. It is heterodiegetic. It is not the same as this text. Right? Homodiegetic, related to this text. Heterodiegetic, not related to this text. And then internal and external. Is it part of the story or is it outside of the story? Right? So this has to do with whether it's in or out and then related or not related. And this can be for both flashbacks or flash forwards, anticipations. It can be for either analepsis or prolepsis. Okay. So those are those two, internal and external, and then heterodiegetic and homodiegetic. Then you get partial versus complete. Okay. This is really, really simple. Does the story connect with this change in order, right? Does it connect with the flashback or flash forward, or does it not? Okay, if there's, say, this romance story that we're talking about, there's a romance story between these two characters. If there's a flashback, and in that flashback, we see that there was once a time when they were not together. And then we don't actually get shown how they got together, then it is partial. Because we don't actually see how it connects. We know that it does eventually connect, but we're not actually shown how it connects. Right? We don't actually know how it connected. Right? So that means it is partial. Or prolepsis is the same. Let's say, for instance, we see there's an entire story about this love between these two people, and at the end, we see that one of them dies before the other. But what if the actual story, right, it sort of says in the narrative, eventually, blah, 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 whatever this person's name is, this person would eventually become immensely sad when their partner died before them. And then the story continues. Now, what if the story ends basically when these characters get married? So you never actually see them die, but because of this prolepsis, because of this anticipation, we know that one of them is going to die first. And it's going to be sad, but it's not part of the story. We don't get to actually see them dying, because the story itself ends when they get married. We just know that at some point in the future, one of them dies first. That is partial, because we don't get to see how it got to that point. We only get to know that it happens. Complete would be the opposite, right? Complete is if it does happen, right? So basically, you do get to see it happening. So let's say in the story, in the beginning of the story, you see an anticipation about how they're going to get married. And then, later in the story, they get married. then that would be complete, right? We saw the anticipation, and then we actually got the resolution. We were told about this future that's going to happen, and then the future actually happened for us to see. So that is partial versus complete. And this, remember, once again, applies to both analepsis or prolepsis. It can be a flash back or a flash forward. It doesn't matter. The next type is called a completing analepsis or prolepsis. Now, this is not the same as complete. I know, it's very annoying. Basically, a completing analepsis is one that basically like fills in a sort of a gap in the story. Okay? So, basically, do we skip to what happens next? Right? Do we sort of move away from the narrative and then continue with it? Or do we only really get to see things sort of once or twice? Right? So, basically, completing, how do we get to the flashback or the flash forward? How do we get to that point? You know, do we basically see it being completed or not? And then repeating is sort of in a similar sense also known as recalls. This is sort of something that allows a story to retrace its own steps. So basically, you can repeat some kind of an analepsis or a prolepsis, right? So it happening over and over again. There's two main types, known as deferred signification and redundancy. Deferred signification is basically the idea of establishing some kind of an idea and then rendering it altered when time goes on. So think of a story in which you keep on seeing over and over again, you see something that's going to happen in the future, but you don't actually understand it yet. So imagine this romance story that we've just made up in our heads, right? There's a romance story, cool. But every now and then, you see a flash forward to one of the characters looking at the other one with sadness. And then it goes back to the story. And you sort of think to yourself, well, what made them sad? And then as the story continues, you learn some terrible news about a character, and then it does the flash forward again. Now all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's because he's dying. Oh no. And then the story continues, and it turns out that this person, like, let's say they had cancer, and then they beat the cancer, and you're like, oh, okay. And then you get the flash forward again, and you see this other character is sad, and you're like, well, it's not because of the cancer. Why are they sad? See, so each time you're being hit with the same flash forward, right, over and over again, but you don't actually have enough information to understand it yet, right? You're going to understand it eventually, maybe, unless it's very sort of postmodern, in which case they might not want you to understand it, but generally speaking, you're going to eventually understand it because you're going to keep repeating it. And then also the other one, which is, so this is deferred signification, and you get redundancy, which is basically you're shown it to the point where it becomes essentially redundant and meaningless, in a sense. So this can happen with analepsis or prolepsis, just like all of these, right? You can show the same flash forward or flashback over and over again for some or another reason. The reason will be dependent on the story itself. You know, you can't just say, oh, the reason that analepsis is used is because of this. You can't do that. There's many different reasons that you might use distortions in the order of a narrative. So this is basically the order part of Genette. It is definitely the most complex. Duration and frequency are not as complex. So order, remember, is made up of analepsis, prolepsis, and acrony. And within analepsis and prolepsis, you can get internal/external. You also get mixed, where it sort of brings the two together. Homodiegetic and heterodiegetic, also mixed, right? Then you get partial, complete, and then you get completing and repeating. These apply to all of them. If you're going to be doing an in-depth discussion about narrative time, you don't necessarily have to talk about every single one of these concepts, but it would be a good idea to at least touch on some of them. Not every story has all of them, obviously. And also, actually, when it does come to narratives and all of these concepts, analepsis is a lot more it's a lot more common, right? Think about when you think of stories, you'll be like, oh, I know many stories that have flashbacks. Like, how many stories start in media res, which means starts in the middle of things and then jumps back in time. So most of the story is actually a flashback. That happens all the time. That is a very, very common thing that you will find in just so many stories. Flashbacks are much more common. Prolepsis, they're not as common. So prolepses, they're just not that common in comparison, but you do get them. Usually they're actually as like an aside. I remember one from a book called Dangerous Love, which is a fantastic book. And in Dangerous Love, there's just one part where a character, the main character, is like an artist, but I don't think he's not like a successful artist. He's just an artist. He has a job that is not related to the art. But at some point, someone either, I think, steals a painting of his or something, and then it just says, years later, he would see that his painting that was taken from him, he would see it on the front cover of a book about Africa, because it takes place in Nigeria, and it's sort of a book about Africa, and the photo is credited to unknown. So, and then it carries on with the story. So you don't get to see the rest of how it came to be like that. You just get this quick flash forward to sort of say, this is what actually happened to this painting after it was, stolen or whatever it happened to be. So you see, that is something that is quite an interesting thing. You don't get prolepsis as much as analepsis, but it is definitely something interesting. All right, so that's order, right? How do you break the chronology of a story, right? Chronology starts at the beginning, ends at the end. But a lot of stories break it up and move things around. So that's what order was all about. And we are now done with order. Alright, so now that we're done with order, we can move on to duration. Remember, there's 3 major parts to narrative time, according to Genette: order, duration, frequency. Duration is the second one. Okay, so what is duration? How long does an event take place? That's what duration means, right? Order is the order of events. Duration is the duration of events. All right. Now, he actually talks about 4, but I added a 5th one because I think it's a useful one to add. Because basically, this entire video is kind of a bit of an adaptation of an assignment I did for my honors, which happened to be the assignment that I did the best in because I went super in-depth into everything. It was great. I had a lot of fun. So basically, duration. Okay. Duration is how long does an event happen? Any event in the story. Let's go back to our idea of that romance story we've been making up in our heads. It goes over their first date, right? These 2 characters have their first date with one another, and they're sort of instantly infatuated with one another. How long do you make that event? Right? Do you make it long? Do you make it short? And then what about after that? How long do you make... So obviously these 2 characters got together for a date. They went to a restaurant. They had a great time. However, how did they get to the restaurant? That also did happen, even if it's not narrated. It did happen. So there's always things that happen. Also think about a very, very common thing you sometimes hear people making fun of about stories. In a story, characters, unless it's a joke or it's actually part of the plot, you never seem to see characters going to the toilet. Yet you do assume that they are going to the toilet. No one can hold it in for that long, right? No one can be like, okay, this story takes place over the course of several months. No one's holding in their pee that whole time, right? Also, people eat. Generally, like 3 meals a day. At least that's what's expected, right? 3 meals a day. Okay, you don't see characters eating meals 3 times a day in stories. And that's because it's seen as unnecessary information unless it is specifically necessary to the plot. Okay, so now let's look at the duration of events. You can either have it summarized, right? That's the first one I put here, summary. You can have it summarized. You can sort of say, you can go through it very, very quickly, rather than being like, okay, cool. I'm going to explain the entire scene in depth. I'm just going to summarize it. So rather than that, this is really, really good to see when it comes to travel, right? The characters are going to travel to the restaurant to have their first date. Okay, do I sort of say, person number 1 got out of their house. They were wearing their clothes for the date. They walked into their garage. They opened the garage. They got into the car. They turned the key in the ignition. They looked back to make sure that they weren't going to hit anything. They slowly reversed. They closed the gate, of course. They waited for the door to close. And then they drove. The first turn was right. You wouldn't do that unless you're doing it on purpose, right? But you wouldn't go in depth into how the person drove to the restaurant. You would just say, person A got into their car, drove to the restaurant. That's a summary. You're just saying, this is what happened, I'm done. Cool, there we go. You're just summarizing the events. You're just saying, okay, I started here, there we go, I'm done. I'm bored now, I'm done. It's a summary. Ellipsis. Now, ellipsis, you might be more associated or more comfortable, or what word am I looking for? More familiar with the word ellipsis being used in a grammatical sense. An ellipsis in grammar is the 3 dots. Right? Usually meaning that either you've removed information or you're trailing off. That's what an ellipsis is. Basically, it is withheld information or information that has been taken away. That is what an ellipsis is. An ellipsis, in terms of narrative time, is when you just skip the thing. So, John got ready, and then he was at the restaurant for the date. There we go. He was getting ready, and then he's at the restaurant. We skipped over the we didn't even summarize the travel. We just skipped it. And this happens all the time, right? Person has date, and then it will skip to, like, okay, the date ends, and then it will skip to being like, oh, the next morning they were both giddy about the date and really excited to see the person again. Look at that. Ellipsis. You skipped over their entire sleep. You skipped over an entire day. You didn't sit there and say, person A climbed into the bed, then they lay on their right side, but they weren't quite comfortable, so they decided to put their arm higher, and then they were more comfortable, and then they decided they put on something because they were struggling to fall asleep, and then they did eventually fall asleep, and then while they were sleeping they dreamed. You wouldn't do that. You would just skip over it. You would just be like, okay, cool, we're done now, because this is not necessary information for the story I want to convey. So you move over. Then you get slow down. Now, in Genette, slow down and pause are kind of seen as the same thing. I, strictly speaking, do not agree. So I've had a slow down and pause. Right? A slow down is when you make things go really slow motion. Right? And a pause is when you stop it completely. So think of like a single moment stretched out in a story. Right? These two characters are about to kiss for the first time. And then you go into their internal monologues. What are they thinking about as this happens? You know, are their hearts beating fast, and they're super excited, and but it could go for pages. You could go pages and pages of their feelings and thoughts in the 3 seconds it takes for their lips to join. You can do that. You can slow down the story to focus on these rapid fire thoughts and ideas. There could even be like a flashback in between these things to really elongate it, right? So it could either slow down or it could pause the action entirely. They are both very similar to each other, so I'm just going to talk about them at the same time. So think about it like that, right? You can slow the events down, because if you just showed it as is, it would basically be like, these two people kissed. But imagine if instead I was like, these two people together, and then I go to person A, and if person A was thinking this, and then I go to person B, and they were thinking this, and this, and then they kiss. And then I could be like, while they're kissing, person A is thinking this and this, person B is thinking this and this. When their lips separate from one another, person A thinks this, and person B thinks this. See, there's slowdowns and pauses there all the time, like slowing down the narrative to basically elaborate on something that's happening. Okay, so basically that's the primary ways to alter duration. The other one is just called scene. Basically, it is happening at the same rate at which it would be happening in real life. Right? It's a scene. You're telling the entire date. You're explaining what happens in the date. There's no distortions in the duration. But that does go into some tricky ideas about the idea of reading time versus narrative time, right? How long does it take you to read a thing, like the textual time, versus how long the event actually took place? Because the only way to have true scene is in dialogue. Because dialogue takes as long to basically read as it does to say. Not technically, but if you were reading it out loud, right? It would take about the same amount of time, and then the narration between them would be different. But essentially, for the purpose of simplicity, scene is basically the duration is going as fast as it is actually going in the real world, right? This is easier to see in like a movie, where if you were to film an entire actual scene between two characters without skipping anything, that would be scene. It would be in order. Okay, so that's order and duration, right? So duration is how long do the things take place? Are they summarized? Are they completely removed? Are they slowed down or paused? Or are they just going at their regular pace? Last thing we have to get into is frequency. Frequency is the easiest one. Basically, how many times does the thing happen in a story? But there's basically 4 different types, right? Because events can either happen once, or they can happen multiple times, right? And they can either be told in the story once or multiple times. Sometimes things are also just skipped. So you could say there's 5 things in frequency. So, is a thing happening more than once, and it is only told once, or is it told multiple times? See, there's 2 different ways of looking at frequency in that sense. Let's just say the characters have breakfast together in this romance. I only show them having breakfast together once. Does that mean they only ever had breakfast together once because I only showed it once? No. But what if I show their first date? I show the first date once, and it happens once. You can't have a second first date. That's the idea of a first date. It is only once. It only happens once. So it happened once, it was told once. Or it could happen once and it's told multiple times. So what if I have the date, and then the characters keep on remembering the date, the first date. They keep on thinking back to it. So one event happens multiple times in the story. Even though, in terms of the actual narrative, it only happened once, it happens multiple times in their heads. So you see, the frequency increases. Or you could have something that happens multiple times, only told once or told multiple times. So what if I keep on doing their breakfast every morning? I show them having breakfast in the story. Cool. I'm showing them have breakfast each time. But I could also only show them having breakfast once. The frequency depends. So basically, when you are looking at a story and you're looking at frequency, you can look at that. Any event, does it happen once or does it happen multiple times? And not just does it happen, but how many times is it told? Because that is a very, very important thing to understand about narrative time, now that we've gone over all of these things. Narrative time is not just about the order and duration and frequency of events, but also how they are conveyed. Right? It's not just about does it happen, but it's also, is it actually told? Are we told these things in the story? Are we given this information? How many times, in what order, and for how long? There is the narrative time versus the textual time. The narrative time is right like, okay, this is how long their date lasted, 1 hour. Does it take an hour to read that scene in the book, which will be then an hour of textual time? Are we given this date in chronological order, or is it a flashback or a flash forward? Or is it just chronological? What is it? How many times are we shown it? You see, these are all things. There's the narrative, and there's the actual text. And that is something important to keep in mind when you are going over narrative time. So that is my explanation of narrative time. I went into basically all of the major Genetian concepts about order, duration, and frequency. So hopefully this has been helpful to whoever does need this. It's quite a lengthy video talking about all this stuff. So, very fun time. I hope it has been helpful. And yeah, that's basically it. So, going back to the thing I said at the very, very beginning of this, episode, this video, is if you appreciate the kind of work that I do here and you would like to support the kind of work that I do here, you can check out any of my books, or you can join my Patreon and give me some money to continue doing stuff like this. This is going to basically be my final year of these unscripted videos that are going into specifically these narrative and sort of literature concepts. This year I'm going to be doing basically the rest of this entire subject, because basically you might notice for those who are just interested in this, you might see something at the end of the video title called THL3701, Unisa. Basically, all of these are specifically aimed towards a specific module in the University of South Africa. So basically what I do is I'm going over all of these concepts in the order that I actually did them, because I did this undergraduate and I now have an MA. So basically I'm going back and explaining all of the concepts for those people who maybe struggle a bit more with them. So I'm going to be doing every single subject in the THL undergraduate course. Every single one. I've already done a bunch of them. This year I'm going to be finishing the rest of them. So if you're interested, you can support me in any way that you want. Or you can just do the usual things like liking, commenting, whatever you want to do. So that is pretty much that. I hope that you have a great day, week, and month ahead, and goodbye.